then could I introduce to you Dr. Robert E. Ulanowicz.
Thank you, Father Wimmer, for that wonderful and generous introduction. And thank you, Father Wimmer and Father Crossan, for inviting me to be part of this very exciting program. It's so good to see some old friends and faces again here at WTU, and to be in a Catholic institution that still treasures scholarship and seeks for a balance between fides et ratio. And as WTU faces an uncertain future, I think it's very important that all of us who've had any association with it carry these attitudes forward wherever we may go into the world or in the church. Now, speaking of fides and ratio, probably most of you are aware that a significant factor in the secularization of Western society over the past 300 years has been the repeated attempts at demythologizing elements of sacred scripture and belief by advances in science. Now, by contrast, one hardly ever hears about theologians criticizing science. I would suggest that this is an unhealthy imbalance, that it's not healthy, certainly not for religion, but also for science, that the dialogue should remain such a one-way street. Rather, as Karol Wojtyła, the late Pope John Paul II, succinctly put it, a more balanced conversation should consist not only of science purifying religion of error and superstition, but also of religion warning science against idolatry and false absolutes. False absolutes. What are we to make of that in an enterprise like science that declares there are no absolutes? Well, I don't have sufficient time to address the root assumptions of science. If you're interested, I have a book out here that's on display, and I urge you to go to the library and take it out. But what I would like to do today is single out a few propositions used by some in science to challenge faith. There exists, for example, a widespread conviction on the part of secularists that the laws of physics are universal and never violated, and therefore they determine everything that we see. Thus it is that Nobel laureates such as Murray Gell-Mann, Steven Weinberg, and David Gross proclaim that all causality points downward, and that there is nothing down there but the laws of physics. In the very same vein, in the A Brief History of Time, the popular scientific figures Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking wrote that there is simply nothing left for a creator to do. So prevalent is this belief in the absolute role of physical laws in nature that even a staunch theist like Philip Hefner, who's a pioneer in the conversation between religion and science, was asked, "Do you believe in miracles?" And he answered, "No, God just doesn't have enough wiggle room." What are we going to make of this? Some of the best minds in science are declaring that physics leaves no room whatsoever for God. What does one tell a student or parishioner who comes to you in anguish and repeats these declarations? Well, I would begin by saying that the very best minds, using impeccable logic, but starting from false absolutes, could arrive at erroneous conclusions. Let's follow this up a little by examining the nature of universal laws, such as the four force laws of physics: gravity, the electromagnetic, the weak and the strong nuclear forces. Firstly, it is important to note that universal laws can be expressed only in terms of universal homogeneous physical characteristics, things such as mass or electrical charge. Any particular detail beyond these homogeneous characteristics either has to be ignored or relegated to what is known as the accompanying boundary statement. Okay, so what is a boundary statement? Well, it's common knowledge in physics that a full statement of any problem requires two parts. The first part, and the one that all the attention is focused on, is the universal law or set of laws that govern the behavior of a given system and a particular region of space over a particular time. The problem statement remains incomplete, however, until the investigator makes a second and accompanying statement about the relative circumstances that exist at the spatial boundary or at the start. This is called the boundary value problem. Now, for example, one might wish to calculate the trajectory of a cannonball. The appropriate law would be Newton's second law of motion in the presence of gravity. The specific trajectory and impact point, however, cannot be calculated until one stipulates at least the location of the cannon, the muzzle velocity, and the angle of the cannon with respect to the Earth. Now, the boundary statements differ radically from the laws in the sense that those statements must remain entirely contingent. That is, the boundary contingencies in general must remain absolutely arbitrary. Why? Because if one could identify boundary conditions to which the laws could not conform, then by definition, the laws would no longer be universal. So now it behooves us to examine the range of specifications that we can make that would fall under the umbrella of contingencies. First off, the reason why little attention is usually paid to the boundary statement is that boundary conditions have been implicitly assumed to be anything that an investigator chooses them to be. Notice that this is a tacit assumption that infers that intentionality cannot be disqualified as a form of contingency. Most of the time, the chosen boundary conditions are of a regular and ordered nature. Nothing, however, prohibits boundary conditions that can be characterized as blind chance, for example. Now, the mathematical theories of probability and statistics have proven to be quite successful in dealing with blind chance, by which is meant random events that are simple, directionless, indistinguishable, and repeatable. Okay? Four strong conditions. But not all chance satisfies these criteria. One example, for example, could consist of the combined actions of multiple simple chance events, which can be characterized as a compound event. Such combinations cannot be, and usually are not, directionless. Furthermore, physicist Walter Elsasser has shown that whenever more than about 75 distinguishable elements or chance events combine, the resulting amalgamation is referred to as being physically unique because it would take an interval of more than 1,000,000 times the age of the universe before that particular combination could be expected to reoccur again by chance. Let's give an example. Let's try to give some reality to this. Suppose you're a photographer on the mezzanine of Grand Central Station and you take a snapshot of the crowd below you that captures maybe 80 travelers. There is simply no physically realistic chance that any photographer will capture exactly the same set of individuals at some later time by chance. Moreover, at different times of the day, it may be readily evident that there are different preferred directions. For example, in the morning it may be towards the trains, in the afternoon away from the trains. Because they are not repeatable, unique events cannot be treated by common statistical techniques. And I call such unique chance events radical. And such phenomena thoroughly pervade the complex systems of ecology and the social sciences. Going further, I would contend that it is a false dichotomy, false absolute, if you will, to assume, as Jacques Monod did, there is a strict separation between chance and necessity. In between blind chance and strict determinism lies a continuum of events that's characterized by the degree to which the arbitrary is constrained by the order with which it is fused. At one end of this blind spectrum, unconstrained chance occurs in a directionless environment. Once there are constraints of any sort, however, like, for example, the imbalance of loaded dice, the resulting conditional probabilities will differ from those calculated for blind chance. Going even further, Karl Popper pointed to conditional probabilities that grow progressively so constrained that certain outcomes dominate, although occasionally other interferences may still occur. Well, for example, during the early 20th century, over 9 out of 10 young immigrants to America married someone from their own ethnic group, although a few would occasionally take a groom or a bride from native-born or other ethnic groups. Popper labeled such dominant outcomes, like 9 out of 10 propensities, and considered them to be more general than laws, which he thought were determinate only in a vacuum under artificial conditions. So, we thus recognize a spectrum, an entire spectrum of phenomena that legitimately can be called contingencies. And they range from radical novel chance through blind chance, and running the gamut from conditional chance to propensities to intentionalities to determinism, an entire spectrum. It is mistaken presumption to insist that blind chance and universal laws always act dichotomously in natural systems. Okay, by now some of you may be growing restless with all this emphasis on chance and arbitrariness. I mean, there's a lot of order out in the world, and what, if not physical laws and so forth, determined physical laws, can account for this order and regularity? And of course, I acknowledge the necessity of laws. I mean, I'm not crazy, okay? In the creation of such regularities. But I would like to emphasize that it doesn't stop there. I wish to argue that laws explain less about what we observe than do configurations of phenomena known as mutualisms, or even the more numerous indirect mutualisms. Now, simple mutualistic behaviors were first treated in chemistry, where they were identified as autocatalysis. Auto meaning self, catalysis meaning a quickening, a process that through its interactions with others tends to speed itself up. I understand you were given a little outline of the talk, and there are some figures on there. If you would check out figure number 1. One may envision autocatalysis as a loop of processes wherein each member accelerates its immediate downstream neighbor. In figure 1, for example, if process A facilitates another process B, and B catalyzes C, which in turn augments A, then the activity of A indirectly promotes itself. The same goes, of course, for B and C. In general, A, B, and C can be objects, processes, or events. And the linkages, the arrows, can be deterministic, that is mechanical, or they can be contingent. My favorite example of autocatalysis is the aquatic community that develops around a family of aquatic weeds known as bladderworts. If you look at figure 2, all bladderworts are carnivorous plants because scattered along the feather-like stems and leaves of these plants are small, visible bladders, those little black dots. And one of the black dots is shown in blue. At the end of each bladder are a few hair-like triggers, which, when touched by any tiny suspended animal, such as little 1/10 of a millimeter water fleas or cladocera, will open up, and there's a negative osmotic pressure that sucks the animal in, it closes, sort of like the Venus flytrap, okay, and becomes food for the plant. In nature, figure 3 now, in nature, the surface of bladderworts always hosts a growth of algae as a film. That's the little dotted speckled area around the bladderwort stem. The surface growth serves in turn as food for a variety of tiny microscopic animals. Thus, the bladderworts provide a surface upon which the algae can grow. The algae feed the microanimals, which in turn close the cycle by becoming food for the bladderwort. I used to call this the cowboy plant. My daughter did a science project on it at one time. Now, the autocatalysis associated with life processes, when it is impacted by random singular contingent events, results in non-mechanical behaviors. Okay, for one, Autocatalysis exerts selection pressure upon all of its participating elements. If there happens to be some contingent change, for example, in the surface algae that either allows more algae to grow on the same surface of a bladderwort by being more transparent, or makes the algae more digestible to the tiny floating animals, then the effect of the increased algal activity, which the contingency induces, will be rewarded 2 steps later by more bladderwort surface. The activity of all the members of the triad will be increased. Conversely, if the contingency either decreases the possible algal density or makes algae less palatable or digestible to the microanimals, then the rates of all 3 processes will be attenuated. Simply put, contingencies that facilitate any component process will be rewarded, whereas those that interfere with facilitation anywhere will be minimalized, decremented. One special feature of autocatalysis that is essential to the life process, although if you look at the list of the attributes of life, you probably won't find it, but I guarantee you it's absolutely essential. Thermodynamics requires that each step along the autocatalytic loop use energy and material to continue functioning. Now, it follows from the argument that I just gave about selection that an increase of resource input to any component process will be rewarded. The result is that all the avenues of resources into the autocatalytic loop will be amplified, a phenomenon that I have called, after Newton, centripetality. Okay? It's the opposite of centrifugality, which throws things out. Centripetality pulls them in. Such centripetality, or pulling in, is evident, for example, in coral reef communities, which sequester major concentrations of nutrients well over and above those in the surrounding oceanic desert. The ratcheting up of activity and its accompanying centripetality together constitutes what we commonly refer to as growth. Growth, especially in the geometric proportions described by Thomas Malthus, played a major role in Darwin's narrative. Unfortunately, the growth side of evolution has been downplayed by later disciples of Darwin to the point where it now appears as a given, not warranting further attention. But Darwin's full dynamically is strictly bilateral and might be paraphrased as growth proposes, natural selection disposes. Contemporary discussions of evolution overstate the eliminative role of nature designated as natural selection. But the enormous advantages imparted to some species by autocatalysis and accompanying centripetality remain virtually absent from the modernist narrative. Now, another imbalance in contemporary evolutionary theory is its inordinate focus upon competition. Competition with other organisms in combination with elimination by adverse physical circumstances is said to account for the bulk of natural selection. Like growth, the existence of competition is assumed as a given. But our spotlight on autocatalytic centripetality now allows us to explore the origins of competition. In particular, whenever multiple centripetalities arise within a limited pool of resources, competition among the associated configurations is the inevitable result. Viewed in this framework, competition becomes strictly derivative of centripetality, which in turn depends upon mutuality. Okay? I find it entirely ironical that today you can encounter conferences and papers devoted to resolving how observed mutualisms could possibly arise out of a natural world that is totally driven everywhere by competition. That problem, of course, is ill-posed because it is mutuality that is fundamental, out of which competition derives secondarily, okay? You can't have competition at any one level without first having mutuality at the level below it. Finally, the contemporary Darwinian scenario errs when it repeatedly, and I would say schizophrenically, switches back and forth between random chance mutations of the DNA molecule and the presumably lawful behaviors of much larger organisms. Excluded from the discussion is an entire spectrum of autocatalytic behaviors that are active at the biomolecular, the cellular, and the organ levels. As I have argued, each such loop promotes the dominance of its participants and can change in response to impacts from radical chance events that occur at each of the intervening levels. Okay, thus far I've elaborated two themes, and they're opposing to a large extent, actually. There's the arbitrary nature of contingency that tends to degrade constraints. And opposing it is the order-producing action of autocatalysis. This larger picture, inherent in Darwin's full narrative, resembles an ancient dialectic proposed by the early Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who saw nature as the outcome of two opposing tendencies, one that builds up order and another that tears it down. Some of you may also see it in the Eastern attitude of yin-yang, if you will. Unfortunately, what we have inherited from the followers of Darwin is an obsession with only the latter half of the dynamic. But one does not have to go as far as biology to realize just how one-sided our current view is of the universe. For example, the preeminent physicist John Wheeler was deeply troubled by simplistic thinking on the part of his colleagues who were studying the physics of elementary particles. He worried that a burgeoning constructivism in physics was being mistaken for absolute reality. The idea was that they had this theory that would predict various particles and where they should be, and they went out to discover those particles, and Wheeler was saying, well, are you discovering them or are you synthesizing them? Okay? Anyway, he illustrated his misgivings via a metaphor that I like to refer to as Wheeler's parable of the parlor game. According to Wheeler, the evolution of science is like a game played by a number of guests at a dinner party. Okay, suppose Father Crossan decides to host a dinner party for a dozen or so of us, and dinner is a little bit late. So he says, okay, occupy yourselves with the game while I'm finishing dinner. Okay, so we decide we're going to play 20 questions, and the idea here is they're going to send somebody out of the room, maybe Father Wimmer, and he's going to come back and he's going to ask us questions that we have to answer with simple yes or no, okay? Until he guesses what the word is that we've decided upon. So Father Wimmer leaves the room, and troublemaker that I am, I say, hey, there is no word. Okay? Rather, when Father Wimmer comes back in, he can ask Professor Domling over here the first question, and Professor Domling could say yes or no, pure wisdom, okay? Howard wisdom. Then he asks Father Weissman over here a second question, and he can say yes or no, as he feels like. The only condition on Father Weissman's answer is that it cannot contradict Professor Domling's answer, okay? And then he goes on to ask Dr. Fagg a third question. Dr. Fagg can say yes or no, and the only constraint, or actually a couple of constraints, is that his yes or no cannot contradict the first two. It has to be coherent with the first two. And Father Wimmer keeps guessing and guessing until he asks the question, is the word theology? And the only possible non-contradictory answer is yes. Okay? Okay. This is a rich parable. And parables are meant to make you feel a little uncomfortable. Now, what strikes people first about Wheeler's parable usually is the indeterminate nature of the outcome. Okay? And the parallels, however, with evolution are richer and deeper, and I try to scope them out here. Of especial interest are the rules of the game, which are meant to correspond to the laws of nature. one immediately sees that the rules do not determine the end point. Okay? They guide, they constrain activity, presuming that the participants abide strictly by them, of course, but they cannot of themselves specify the outcome. Okay? They are necessary, but they don't specify. This accords with our foregoing assumption about the role of physical laws in evolution. Those laws are not violated, but universal laws cast in terms of simplistic generalities are insufficient to deal with a hyper-astronomical number of possibilities. They cannot differentiate a single outcome from among, thousands or millions of possible configurations that can satisfy all of the laws equally and exactly. It gets even more interesting. In Wheeler's game, the specific outcome is the result of a dialogue between two parties. On one hand, the questioner is seeking to narrow progressively the field of possibilities, while the intent of the rest of the players is to maintain the field as wide open as possible for as long as feasible. Now, in nature, the role of the questioner is played by natural selection, not only in its traditional eliminative sense, but also in the form of autocalytic action that promotes the growth of its members while drawing resources away from non-participating elements. Both actions, eliminative and autocatalytic, serve to narrow the number of persisting elements. Now, as far as the rest of the respondents that try to keep the options open, in nature, that selection is being opposed by all of the arbitrary, redundant, inefficient, and noisy events that constantly degrade existing constraints. But at the same time, those disturbances are creating a broader manifold of new possibilities. Now, of course, all metaphors are imperfect, and Wheeler's parable is certainly no exception. It culminates in short order at a fixed endpoint, whereas natural evolution continues to work over deep time. Furthermore, the natural dialectic between selection and disordering is not simply one of direct opposition. As philosopher Georg Hegel pointed out, many dialectics are carried out at more than one level. While in the short run, the two tendencies are antagonistic, over the longer term, they can grow mutually interdependent. For example, in order for autocatalysis to continue to perform selection, it must have access to a continuing renewal of contingencies. Conversely, the more rigidly streamlined a system operation becomes, the more resources it captures and dissipates, the more dissipation it creates. The two exist in tension with one another at one level, but neither can totally eliminate the other without eliminating itself. Systems without structure and efficiency cannot compete. Those without flexibility cannot adapt. One-sided maxima, such as unbounded efficiency or the fittest or the fastest, simply cannot fully capture the core of evolutionary theory. Such discrepancies notwithstanding, Wheeler's parable suggests an outstanding conclusion. It is not universal laws that create the many enduring forms that comprise the world. Rather, it is a transaction between opposing contingencies that actually results in the history we inherit. Everything that we see, everything in this room, for example, is what I would call congealed contingency, congealed mutuality, if you will. Laws necessarily mediate or referee the ongoing exchange, but they do not drive it. Now, this new and wider perspective on evolution has manifold implications for science, for society, and for theology. We recognize now that we do not inhabit a clockwork universe, one in which everything is determined in a rigid mechanical fashion by the laws of physics. Rather, as theologian John Haught has suggested, a more appropriate metaphor for an evolutionary world is the drama, wherein the theatrical elements of unexpectedness, continuity, and time correspond in nature to contingency, self-reference, and history, respectively. The popular mechanical material depiction of the brain as a determinate machine must yield to one of a human psyche that exists at several independent levels and exhibits sufficient flexibility to act in an autonomous, intentional manner. In this wider evolutionary scenario, free will isn't just a possibility, it is a reality that is central to the notion of humanity. This expanded evolutionary narrative presents theologians with both manifold opportunities and with significant challenges. The realization that contingencies and not universal laws drive this complex world implies an abundance of heretofore unrecognized wiggle room at all levels of the universe. It's not that there is no wiggle room, it's that there's a lot of wiggle room over evolutionary time. The old deist notion that God could only have acted at the beginning of the universe was far too narrow. The larger view finds the Creator with ample opportunities to remain in continuing dialogue with creation. In particular, divine intervention no longer appears as an absurdity, nor is intercessory prayer necessarily ineffectual. Perhaps the greatest challenge to faith for the largest number of people is the existence of suffering and evil, or what's called theodicy. And I'm sorry to say that, well, I think, and we'll hear more about this later, that this more complete description of evolution does not entirely resolve this enigma, but it does provide a new angle on the problem. Because without contingencies, there can be neither evolution nor progress. Just like with the parable of the weeds and wheat, eliminating all evils would impair opportunities for doing good and going forward. Thus, there are solid rational reasons to avoid Puritanism. Rational accommodation, however, in my mind, does not extinguish the existential pain in the wake of catastrophic natural calamities or massive social evils. Such anguish, I think, can be only dealt with through the light of faith. We're going to hear more about this in the next talk from Professor Dominic, who will elaborate on this much further. Now, doubtless, some Christian theologians will object to this process view of evolution that I've outlined, because to them it's heresy. It seemingly contradicts the Neoplatonist foundations of both medieval theology and Enlightenment science. Plato taught that there were pure, unchanging essences that exist in relation to which all real entities bear incomplete correspondence. Now, by contrast, process theology and this evolution I'm talking about would suggest that God could actually change over time. Heresy. Okay. I'm going to suggest that a popular notion from ecology might point to the way of a reconciliation of sorts, okay? Because ecosystems are regarded by most ecologists as existing across a succession of levels. Some 9 orders of magnitude usually separate the top from the bottom of an ecosystem. Such levels couple only loosely with one another, and connections between any two domains decrease with increasing distance between them. In other words, the farther apart they are, the less they couple. Okay? Now, phenomena at the largest scales appear constant relative to those at the lowest levels, just as the stars appeared fixed to the ancient astronomers. Now, I would suggest that it would be unnecessarily restrictive to confine a supreme being to only the highest levels. As a panentheist, I feel God is present and active at all levels. Insofar as God exists at the highest realm, the Godhead remains unchanging. Inasmuch as God may be active at lower levels, however, and in particular at the human level, the divine is free to react and change in response to the continuing dialogue, as has been portrayed in Scripture and in churches. What theists are most likely to object to this expanded vision, and many of you might have misgivings about, is the dominant role in it played by contingency. To some, the preponderance of contingency seems to play into the hands of those evolutionary theorists who say that everything visible is the consequence of blind, directionless chance. And you've heard that, Stephen Jay Gould. As I've argued, however, contingency covers far more than just blind chance. It even extends to intentionality, which, because it is contingent, is a manifestation of free will, sort of a seamless garment here. Although the genesis of some phenomena might be traceable to a particular class of contingency, the origins of many others, I say, will remain perforce ambiguous. To give a little bit of example of that. Decisions we face. Was that particular job opportunity a matter of random luck? Or was the hand of some higher agency at work? That from the other side. Was that tsunami that killed hundreds of thousands, was it due to an act of God? Or was it blind chance? The answers to such questions lay shrouded behind what I call an epistemological veil. In other words, they will remain unknowable. And I say it falls to the particular faith of each observer to choose in each case one way or the other. Now, even if one accepts such ambiguity, other believers are still going to be unwilling to admit contingency as the origin of all distinguishable phenomena, as I try to convince you. The idea of tracing all histories to seemingly arbitrary events seems to contradict all semblance of a planned creation. This objection, however, rests on our habit, most scientists, of course, have, of seeing all events as being pushed into existence out of the past. It would be unnecessarily restrictive, however, to confine the action of God to our own limited horizons. Rather, Scripture, going all the way back to Genesis, and theologians such as Teilhard de Chardin and John Pott are inclined to picture the Creator as calling nature out of the future into being. Just as autocatalysis pools resources into its own orbit, St. Bonaventure conceives of the supreme mutuality of Trinitarian love as calling all of existence into being, and our own beings towards the Godhead. The Alpha and the Omega become one. If God is calling into being from the future, it makes little difference how unappealing the starting point may be, just as the unpalatable nature of clay does not detract from a beautiful finished work of pottery or china. One obvious advantage of a comprehensive account of evolution is that it makes room for and highlights mutuality, which is the precursor to love. No longer is social Darwinism the inevitable moral consequence of evolution. The root and drive of all evolution, and even of competition itself, is seen to be mutual beneficence. It is as if the Creator placed the divine signature on nature as a pale reflection of the love shared by the Holy Trinity. I'm reminded here of Saint Therese Coudet, who was the founder of the Senegal Sisters. She had a vision, and she had a vision in which all simple objects she would look at had the word good on them. This is good, and that is good. And the idea here is that even our physical reality is the result of an evolutionary process very similar to what I've talked about, where contingencies drive it. And what really mediates what survives, what becomes history, is mutual beneficence. So there is a pale reflection of the Trinity, even in very simple things. What then can we say in summary about a more balanced evolutionary narrative? And here, a quick look into history might be helpful. Until the early 19th century, both science and theology had been molded along Platonic lines, a conservative world in which nothing is either created or destroyed, a finished, unchanging, natural tapestry. Now, we're all aware of how religion was shaken during the middle of that century by Darwin's introduction of a changing world. But far less attention has been paid to the simultaneous threat that evolution posed to the then prevailing scientific conception of nature. Physics was sent into a one-half century of a major bother and dither about the problem because Sadie Carnot had quantified thermodynamics, the world, as an irreversible, non-deterministic place. And later, Charles Darwin, of course, added insult to injury with his theory of an evolutionary biology. Now, the response of the scientific community to both of these threats was nearly identical. To neutralize each challenge by attempting to withdraw into the comfortable world of conservation and reversibility. Statistical mechanist Ludwig von Boltzmann and Josiah Willard Gibbs attempted to reconcile Carnot's thermodynamics with a modernist view of a conservative physics. Later, Ronald Fisher and Sewell Wright employed virtually the same assumptions and almost identical mathematics to quantify the eliminative workings of natural selection in evolution. These efforts erred, in my opinion, insofar as they ignored any natural features that did not square with mechanical material absolutes. Parenthetically, this is controversial, I would add that after a brief flirtation by the church during the middle of the 20th century to open itself up to the larger natural and social world, the turn of the millennium unfortunately finds it too retreat into a fortress of largely medieval theology. What these parallel conservative movements in both science and religion ignore at their own peril are the greater opportunities inherent in a fuller description of evolution, a portrayal of reality neither as a finished tapestry nor as a mindless clockwork, but as a full-fledged, unfinished historical drama between two countervailing cosmic trends. How much more exciting is that than a clock? Evolution bids us, both scientist and theologian, to de-emphasize the static Platonic picture of the world and return in science to the Heraclitean image of change, and in theology to the Hebraic tradition of dialogue between humanity and God. Such transition can be accomplished only by revamping and reordering fundamental assumptions and discarding false absolute, by placing mutuality or love ahead of competition, by acknowledging the power of contingencies over law, by listening for and responding to the call from beyond the material. To be sure, the voice that calls beckons us into strange and often uncomfortable territory. Just as Hebrew scripture favored the nomadic over the sedentary, scientists are now called to cast aside the security of their academic fiefdoms. Clerics are called to renounce the trappings of ecclesial power. All are called to walk forward or to perish in place. Involvement in drama always entails risks, but the plot itself provides meaning and purpose to life. The pathway is bound at times to seem treacherous, but the one who beckons also reassures that the traveler is not alone. So I leave you with one final exhortation. As regards evolution, be not afraid. It's a glorious drama, not one to be shunned, but one must remain diligent not to let the evolutionary narrative become narrowed and misguided by false absolutes. For when you view it in its full creative breadth, evolution provides for a true refulgence of hope. Thank you very much.
I'm Tom Sheehan. A question having to do with time as a false absolute. Newton thought time was absolute and built his entire theory upon it. Everybody bought that. The old ideas from centuries before kind of vanished, and indeed it became the case that God was subordinate to and lived within time. St. Augustine long ago had said that God created time, but that got lost. And the entire Enlightenment, the theologians, everybody since the time of Newton has, I think, had the stumbling block of believing that time is superior to God, which, according to the first commandment, is putting a false God before God. Can you comment about that?
Only insofar as I mentioned, the idea that our own, first of all, the panentheistic vision of the universe is that God remains above all, including time. So that's sort of the simplistic answer to it. But where was I going with it? My own view, as I've said, is that we need to be more open in terms of causality. In science, we look at everything going forward, whereas in faith, we are allowed to look at God outside of time, beckoning us forward. That's a contradiction, really, of scientific principle, but it's a matter of faith, and it remains a part of those who believe, a part of their absolute. I'm afraid I really can't, I recognize everything, all the elements you mentioned in your question, but I really can't comment on time per se very eloquently. I'm an ecologist by and large, not a physicist. I would just add also that, in all of these dialogues between religion and science, it's always the theologian and the physicist, and no one ever asked, us poor ecologists, what do we think of this? But I feel that we're in a position to help bring the two together. Anything that I've said here isn't meant to be derogatory to physicists, okay? It's a great physicist right here. It's rather to just put physics into perspective, and that the social and the ecological and so forth are also major players.